75 miles north of San Francisco, past a bend in the road where cell service quietly disappears, stands a wall of redwoods older than the country itself. Behind that wall, for 2.5 weeks every summer, some of the most powerful men in America vanish. No press, cameras, nor outside eyes. Armed guards patrol a perimeter that stretches for more than 2,000 acres, and every year, without fail, the same question rises up outside the gates like smoke. What is actually happening in there? In the year 2000, a broadcaster named Alex Jones smuggled a hidden camera past that perimeter and filmed a torchlit ceremony deep in the trees. A hooded procession, a 40-foot stone owl, a coffin carried to an altar and set ablaze. He walked away calling it evidence of a ritual sacrifice. It is a claim that has never been backed up by another reporter, another camera, or a single documented victim. But strip away the fire and the robes, and what is left is still uncomfortable enough on its own. A private club founded more than a century and a half ago, where presidents, industrialists, and the architects of America's biggest decisions gather every year behind locked gates and armed men, completely free from oversight. No sacrifice required to explain why. For over 100 years, people outside the redwoods have never stopped trying to guess what's really happening in the dark. This is the story of the forest where America's most powerful men have spent over a century disappearing behind locked gates, and the century of rumor that filled the silence they left behind. Chapter 1: Bohemia is born. To understand how a forest full of redwoods became one of the most whispered about places in America, you have to go back to a city still rebuilding itself after the chaos of the gold rush. A place bursting with newspapermen, painters, actors, and musicians who had all washed up on the edge of the continent, chasing the same restless dream. San Francisco, in the early 1870s, was a city that loved talk almost as much as it loved money. Saloons doubled as salons. Newsrooms doubled as stages, and a loose, unglamorous group of journalists had started gathering informally, trading stories and cheap whiskey, calling themselves, half-jokingly, Bohemians. In 1872, that loose gathering became something official. A small circle of writers and artists, tired of drinking and arguing in borrowed rooms, formed a club of their own. They wanted a permanent home for what they called social and intellectual intercourse. A place where painters could talk to poets, where actors could talk to editors, where the only currency that mattered was talent. They gave it a name borrowed from the same self-mocking spirit that had defined them from the start: the Bohemian Club. It sounds like the beginning of a purely artistic story, a haven for starving creatives far from the greed of the business world around them. But the truth was more complicated. The club's own members knew almost immediately that talent alone would not keep the lights on. Rent had to be paid, rooms had to be furnished, dues had to be collected from somewhere. One of the founding members put the problem bluntly, admitting that talent without money would not support a club for very long. So, from its earliest days, the Bohemian Club made a decision that would define it for the next century and a half. It opened its doors to something other than artists. It opened them to money. Wealthy businessmen, bankers, and professionals were brought in as what the club called associate members, men who had no particular gift for poetry or painting, but who could write a check when the club needed one. In exchange, they got something just as valuable to them: access. Access to the writers whose columns shaped public opinion, access to the painters whose work hung in the city's finest homes, access to culture and to each other. It was a trade that suited everybody, at least at first. The artist got a clubhouse. The businessmen got a room full of interesting people to impress their friends with. Nobody, in 1872, could have predicted what that simple compromise would eventually grow into. Among the earliest members were names that still echo through American literature. Mark Twain moved through San Francisco's bohemian circles in those years, along with Bret Harte, the writer who had helped put California fiction on the national map, and the sharp-tongued, famously bitter journalist Ambrose Bierce, a man who seemed to specialize in making enemies as easily as he made sentences. These were men who wrote for a living, who drank hard and argued harder, and who, for a while, gave the club exactly the kind of intellectual fire its founders had imagined. But even in those first years, there was a tension humming underneath the friendship. The artists needed the money needed the artists. And every year, a little more of the club's daily life seemed to bend toward the comfort of the men who were paying for it. What began as a refugee for painters and poets was slowly becoming something else entirely, a gathering place for the powerful, wrapped in the costume of the artistic. Nobody rang an alarm bell. There was no single moment where anyone could point and say, "This is where it changed." It happened the way most transformations happen: one dues payment, one new member, one comfortable compromise at a time. And in the Redwood groves north of the city, where the club would soon start spending its summers, that slow transformation was about to accelerate into something far larger than anyone in that first meeting room could have imagined. Chapter 2: From Picnic to Empire. It started, as so many traditions do, with something small and sentimental. In 1878, a member of the Bohemian Club was preparing to leave San Francisco, and his friends decided to send him off properly. Instead of another dinner inside their crowded downtown clubhouse, they organized something different: a picnic. They packed food, crossed the bay, and spent an afternoon outdoors, trading toasts and stories under open sky instead of a smoky ceiling. Nobody involved thought they were starting anything permanent. It was simply a nice way to say goodbye to a friend. But the men who had gathered that day couldn't stop talking about how good it had felt. There was something about being outside, away from the noise and obligations of the city, that suited the Bohemian spirit even better than the clubhouse did. The picnic became an annual event. Then it became something people planned their whole summer around. Year after year, the location shifted and grew a little bigger, a little more elaborate, until the gathering settled into a stretch of land known as Meeker's Grove, a patch of towering redwoods along the Russian River, owned by a local logging family. What had begun as an afternoon farewell was turning into a full encampment, tents and cook fires spreading out beneath trees that had already been standing for hundreds of years before any of these men were born. The redwoods themselves deserve their own introduction, because they are not simply scenery in this story. Some of the trees in that grove had been alive since before the birth of Christ, ancient giants stretching more than 300 feet into the fog, with trunks so wide that a dozen men could barely link hands around them. Walking beneath them, even the wealthiest, most self-important man in San Francisco could feel small. There was something almost spiritual about the setting, a natural cathedral that made the club's yearly retreat feel like more than just a party in the woods. It felt, to the men who kept coming back, like sacred ground. For years, the club simply rented the land they gathered on, dependent on the goodwill of the Meeker family and the uncertainty of a lease that could end at any time. That uncertainty became harder to accept the more the club invested in its summer encampment, and by the 1890s, talk had turned serious. In 1893, the club began formally leasing the property outright, rather than relying on informal arrangements, tightening its grip on the land it had come to think of as its own. It wasn't enough. A lease, no matter how favorable, could always be revoked. If this forest was going to remain the club's spiritual home, the club needed to own it outright. That moment finally came in 1899, when the Bohemian Club purchased the land from Melvin Meeker and his family entirely. What had started as a single farewell picnic just 21 years earlier had transformed into a permanent, privately owned kingdom of ancient trees. More than 2,000 acres of redwood forest that now belonged to a club of artists and businessmen from the city. The men who had once packed a simple picnic basket now controlled a piece of California wilderness larger than some towns. With ownership came ambition, and with ambition came construction. Roads were cut through the property. Rustic cabins and camps began appearing among the trees, clustered together by friendship and, increasingly, by social standing. A rough amphitheater took shape in a natural clearing, a place the club could stage its plays and ceremonies beneath the redwood canopy instead of a painted backdrop. The encampment that had once fit into a single afternoon now stretched across weeks, drawing hundreds of members north from the city every summer, all of them settling into a routine that blended camping, theater, drinking, and increasingly serious conversation. Consider what had actually happened in just over 2 decades. A modest goodbye party for one departing friend had become a permanent, privately guarded forest retreat. purchased outright and built up piece by piece into something resembling a small, self-contained town. The Bohemian Club had grown roots into the California soil, and as those roots deepened, so did the kind of men who wanted to be there when summer came. The picnic had built its cathedral. Now it needed a congregation worthy of it, and San Francisco's wealthiest and most powerful men were more than ready to answer that call. Chapter 3. The Money Moves In. By the turn of the century, word had spread through San Francisco's social circles that something remarkable was happening in that Redwood Grove every summer, and the city's elite wanted in. This was no longer just a retreat for writers trading gossip around a campfire. It had become one of the most desirable invitations in California, a chance to spend weeks in the company of the men who ran the city's banks, shipping lines, railroads, and newspapers, all wrapped in the relaxed, informal air of a camping trip. The businessmen who had once been welcomed in, reluctantly, as a necessary source of dues money, were no longer guests on the artists' terms. They were becoming the club. The numbers tell the story plainly. By 1906, roughly 1 out of every 4 members of San Francisco's exclusive Pacific Union Club, itself a gathering point for the city's wealthiest families, also held a membership in the Bohemian Club. These were not struggling painters or unpublished poets. These were bank presidents, shipping magnates, and men whose family names sat on across the city. The forest that had been purchased in the name of art was filling up, year after year, with the same men who controlled San Francisco's money. The club's original members watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and unease. Membership was growing, the club's finances were healthier than ever, and the summer encampment kept getting bigger and more impressive. But something else was slipping away, and the old guard could feel it even if they struggled to put it into words. The complaints started early and never really stopped. Longtime members grumbled that the salt had been washed out of the club, that whatever raw, unpolished creative energy had defined the early gatherings was being diluted, year by year, by men more interested in deals than in art. One frustrated member went so far as to declare that the true Bohemian spirit had departed entirely, replaced by something more comfortable, more respectable, and far less interesting. Strangely, that exact complaint has never really gone away. Each new generation of members seemed to arrive at the same conclusion their predecessors had reached decades earlier, that the golden age of the Bohemian Club had already passed, that the real artists and the real magic belonged to an earlier, purer era, one that had existed just before they themselves had shown up. Despite all the grumbling, the artists who remained were not simply pushed aside. Some of the era's most recognizable literary names moved through the club's ranks during these years. Mark Twain's presence lingered in the club's memory long after his own visits had ended. Jack London found himself an uneasy fit among the increasingly wealthy membership. He was welcomed for his talent and his fame, but his politics made some of the businessmen in the room visibly uncomfortable, and there are accounts of members needling him, only half-jokingly, about showing up to gatherings in expensive white silk shirts while preaching about the struggles of the working man. It was a small, telling detail. A socialist writer dressed like the very capitalists he criticized, all of them sitting together under the same redwoods, each one a walking contradiction the club never quite resolved. That contradiction became the defining character of the Bohemian Club moving forward. It was neither purely an artist's colony nor purely a businessman's retreat. It was both at once an uneasy marriage between creative ambition and financial power, each side needing the other more than either was willing to admit. The artists gave the club its identity, its plays, its songs, its self-image as something more meaningful than just another gentleman's club. The businessmen gave it the money to keep growing, the connections to keep it relevant, and, increasingly, the influence that would eventually make the Bohemian Grove a name whispered about far beyond the borders of California. As the 20th century began, the club stood at a crossroads it didn't fully recognize yet, caught between the Bohemian dream it was founded on and the empire of power and money it was quietly becoming. Chapter 4. The Owl and the Altar. Every summer, as the encampment filled with bankers and industrialists settling into their assigned camps beneath the redwoods, there was one night the entire club built its calendar around. It came on the opening evening of the retreat, after the sun had dropped behind the tree line, and the forest had gone the particular kind of dark that only exists under a redwood canopy. Thick, complete, and almost total. This was the night of the cremation of care, the ceremony that has done more than anything else to make the Bohemian Grove a name whispered about with suspicion far beyond California. The idea behind it was simple enough on paper. The men gathering in the grove had spent the rest of the year buried in business, politics, and obligation. The ceremony existed to symbolically release them from all of it, to burn away their worries so they could spend the following 2.5 weeks free of the outside world's demands. But simple as the idea sounds, the way the club chose to stage it was anything but simple. It was theater on a scale most Broadway productions couldn't match, built inside an actual forest, using fire, water, and hundreds of participants dressed in robes. At the center of the ceremony stood the owl itself, a shrine carved into the hillside above a small lake, a concrete figure roughly 40 feet tall, its stone eyes catching the torchlight from below. To the men walking toward it in the dark, robed figures moving in procession along the water's edge, the owl was not just a piece of set dressing. It was meant to feel ancient, watchful, and slightly unsettling, a deliberate echo of old-world mythology built by men who understood exactly the kind of atmosphere they were creating. The ceremony followed a fixed script, refined and repeated for more than a century. A small boat, sometimes called a ferry, would carry a coffin across the lake toward the shrine, the coffin representing dull care, a personification of everyday anxiety, obligation, and worry. Robed figures playing the role of high priests would meet it on the shore, chanting invocations to the owl, calling on the spirit of the forest to help the gathered men shed the burdens they had carried in from the outside world. From somewhere up on the hillside, hidden in the trees, a booming amplified voice would cut through the ceremony, mocking the funeral procession below, calling the mourners fools for ever believing they could escape their cares in the first place. It was equal parts solemn ritual and self-aware comedy, the club poking fun at its own theatrics even while fully committing to them. The ceremony built toward its climax as the coffin was finally set ablaze at the base of the owl shrine, flames rising against the dark water and the black silhouette of the trees, fireworks bursting overhead, and the assembled crowd breaking into song, the same tune that had closed the ceremony for generations. An upbeat, almost absurdly cheerful number called "There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight." In a matter of minutes, the mood swung from something resembling a funeral to something closer to a fireworks celebration. And that emotional whiplash was entirely intentional. Care had been cremated. The retreat could officially begin. Over the decades, the production values around this single night grew more elaborate rather than less. The club recruited its own members to script new invocations, compose new music, and refine the staging year after year, treating the ceremony less like a one-off performance and more like a living piece of theater that deserved constant improvement. Even the voice of the owl itself became something of a status symbol inside the club, a role passed down to members with genuine talent for performance. At one point, the booming, resonant tones calling down from the hillside belonged to Walter Cronkite, the broadcaster whose voice had narrated some of the most significant news events of the 20th century to television audiences across America, now lending that same authority to a ceremonial owl in the middle of a private forest. It is precisely this kind of imagery, torch-lit processions, hooded robes, a towering stone owl, a coffin set on fire at the base of a pagan-looking shrine, that has fueled a century of rumor about what really happens inside the Bohemian Grove. Seen from the outside, stripped of context, freeze-framed from a grainy hidden camera angle, the cremation of care looks like something out of a horror film, an elite secret society performing what appears to be a dark ritual deep in the woods, far from any witnesses. It is not difficult to understand why, when footage of this ceremony eventually made its way into the public eye, it landed like a confirmation of everyone's worst suspicions, rather than what the club has always maintained it to be. An elaborate piece of amateur theater, performed by grown men in robes, built on inside jokes and borrowed mythology, with absolutely no violence, sacrifice, or supernatural belief attached to it. What makes the ceremony genuinely strange, rather than sinister, is not what it hides, but what it reveals about the men performing it. These were, and remain, some of the most powerful figures in American business, politics, and finance. Men who spent the other 50 weeks of the year making decisions that shaped the country, choosing to spend one night a year dressed as high priests, chanting invocations to a stone owl, and setting a coffin on fire while singing a 19th century drinking song. It is a portrait less of hidden evil than of hidden absurdity, of the country's most serious men indulging once a year in something almost childishly theatrical. Whether that image comforts you or unsettles you more than the rumors it was meant to dispel is perhaps the real question the cremation of care leaves behind, long after the fire has burned out and the coffin has turned to ash on the shore of the lake. Chapter 5. Weaving Spiders Come Not Here. Beyond the lakeshore, the towering shrine of the owl, the Redwood Grove itself was divided into something far more revealing than any single ceremony could capture. Scattered across the 2,000 acres of forest sat roughly 120 separate camps. If the cremation of care was the theater the outside world fixated on, the camps were where the real texture of the Bohemian Grove lived, quiet, clubby, and stitched together by decades of inherited loyalty. Membership in a camp was rarely a matter of simply showing up and asking to join. Many of these camps operated almost like family property, passed down from father to son, generation after generation, with new members brought in only through personal introduction and long-standing friendship. A man might spend years attending the Grove as a guest before he was ever invited to join a specific camp, and even then, the invitation depended less on wealth or title than on whether the existing members simply liked him, wanted him around, and trusted him to carry on the traditions of that small patch of forest. It created a peculiar kind of hierarchy, one built not on official titles, but on decades of accumulated social capital passed quietly from one summer to the next. Some of these camps became famous within the club's own private mythology, their names carrying weight the way old family estates might elsewhere. Mandalay stood among the most exclusive, a camp so selective that longtime members have described it less as a place you simply walk into and more as a place you are summoned to, an invitation that arrives only after the right people have decided you belong. Caveman carried its own quiet significance, having hosted Herbert Hoover during his years at the club and later serving as a gathering point for Richard Nixon, linking two very different presidential eras under the same canvas roof. Owl's Nest became associated with Ronald Reagan, while Hillbillies carried the presence of George Herbert Walker Bush, each camp absorbing a piece of the presidency into its own private history, long before or after the men in question ever sat in the Oval Office. The club's own motto, displayed prominently and taken seriously by its members, offered a kind of explanation for why these connections mattered so much, and why the outside world was kept so firmly at arm's length. The phrase, borrowed from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, reads simply, "Weaving spiders come not here." The idea, as the club has always explained it, was straightforward enough. Business talk, deal-making, and networking were officially discouraged inside the Grove itself. Men were meant to leave their professional ambitions at the gate, to spend their time in the Redwoods purely as friends, free from the transactional instincts that governed the rest of their lives. Whether that rule was ever fully honored is a question the club's own history complicates at almost every turn. Life inside individual camps developed its own eccentric rituals, small traditions that had nothing to do with power or politics and everything to do with the strange, self-contained culture the club had built for itself over more than a century. At a camp called Poison Oak, members gathered each summer for an event known, with a kind of proud absurdity, as the Bulls Balls Lunch, a long-standing tradition built around exactly the kind of crude, locker room humor you might expect from a group of wealthy men trying to convince themselves they were still just the boys. Over at Owl's Nest, mornings often began with what members called the Gin Fizz Breakfast, a boozy start to the day that set the tone for the relaxed, indulgent atmosphere the entire encampment was built around. Perhaps the strangest tradition of all involved the club's theatrical productions, staged throughout the encampment in the evenings, ranging from the elaborate, high-budget Grove play performed once each retreat to smaller, looser performances called Low Jinks. Because the club remained entirely male, with no women present anywhere on the grounds during the encampment, the female roles in these productions were played by men, some of whom took genuine pride in their ability to convincingly perform in drag, wigs, dresses, and all, in front of an audience made up entirely of their fellow businessmen, judges, and politicians. It was a detail that sat oddly alongside the buttoned-up, conservative reputation of much of the club's membership. Another one of the small contradictions that seemed to define the Grove at every turn. Serious men indulging in deeply silly traditions, powerful men playing dress-up in the woods, all of it hidden behind gates that made sure none of it was ever meant to be seen. Taken together, the camps painted a picture of an elaborate, deeply insular social club, one where inherited friendship mattered more than any formal hierarchy, and where the business of running the country, however much it happened around the campfires, was always, at least officially, supposed to stay outside the gate. Chapter 6, Where Presidents Are Made. Officially, the sign at the gate might as well have read "No business allowed." Unofficially, some of the most important conversations in American political history happened inside those redwoods, in settings so relaxed and casual that the men involved barely seemed to notice history was being made around them. This tension between the club's stated rule against deal-making and the undeniable reality of what actually took place there is where the Bohemian Grove's reputation for shadowy influence finds its firmest ground, not in rumor, but in fact. The clearest, most deliberate example of this influence is something the club built into its own official calendar. Since 1932, the encampment has included a tradition known as the Lakeside Talks, afternoon lectures delivered by members and guests on subjects ranging from science to foreign policy to the economy. On paper, these talks were simply intellectual programming, a continuation of the club's original mission to bring interesting minds together. In practice, the Lakeside Talks became one of the most exclusive stages in American public life, a place where sitting senators, foreign policy experts, business titans, and future presidents could test ideas, take the temperature of the country's most powerful audience, and quietly build the kind of relationships that would shape their careers for decades. It was at this club, informally rather than at any podium, that one of the most important political friendships of the 20th century began. In 1950, Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon crossed paths at the table of Herbert Hoover, the former president and longtime club member whose camp, Caveman, had become a fixture of the Grove's social landscape. Eisenhower was not yet president. Nixon was not yet vice president. But the conversation that started there, over food and drink beneath the redwoods rather than in any official chamber, planted the seeds of a political partnership that would eventually put both men in the White House, first Eisenhower as president, then Nixon as his vice president, and later as president in his own right. Nixon himself returned to the Grove again and again throughout his career, and by his own account, the club played a direct role in one of the most important turning points of his political life. In 1967, still recovering from his bruising loss in the 1960 presidential race and a failed run for California governor 2 years later, Nixon delivered a Lakeside Talk that he would later describe as something close to a comeback speech, a chance to prove to the country's most influential men that he was still a serious political force worth taking seriously again. The speech landed. Within a year, Nixon was running for president again, and this time, he won. The Grove's fingerprints show up again just 1 year later, in 1968, in a conversation Nixon later recounted between himself and Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, sitting together on a bench somewhere among the trees, discussing the shape of that year's Republican primary, and the uneasy question of who should run and who should step aside. It was the kind of quiet, weighty conversation the club's own motto claimed should never happen inside its gates. Two of the most powerful men in California Republican politics working out the contours of a presidential race, off the record and out of earshot, with no reporters anywhere nearby to record it. Perhaps the most historically significant meeting to ever take place inside the Grove had nothing to do with elections at all. In September of 1942, in the earliest, most secretive days of what would eventually become the Manhattan Project, Physicist Ernest Lawrence and Robert Oppenheimer met at the Bohemian Grove to discuss the early organizational structure of the effort to build an atomic bomb. It is a genuinely remarkable historical footnote, one of the most consequential scientific and military undertakings in human history, taking its first organizational shape not in a government office, but among the Redwoods of a private California social club during the club's off-season, when the grounds sat mostly empty. That detail complicates the more sensational version of the Grove's influence that has circulated for decades. This wasn't a meeting of the full club, staged with pageantry and hundreds of members in attendance. It was a handful of men taking advantage of empty private grounds to have a conversation they needed to have somewhere quiet. Researchers who have studied the club closely, including sociologist G. William Domhoff, whose work remains one of the most thorough academic examinations of the Grove's actual function, have been careful to draw a distinction here. The Grove wasn't some shadowy council secretly directing world events from behind the trees. It was, more precisely, a uniquely private venue that powerful men happened to have access to. One that occasionally hosted conversations of enormous weight simply because the men involved already knew and trusted each other, and because the Redwoods offered exactly the kind of privacy that difficult conversations sometimes require. That distinction matters, even if it does little to dampen the mythology that has built up around the Grove over the decades. Presidents were not crowned beneath the owl shrine, but their careers were built, tested, and sometimes saved over the course of a lakeside talk, or a conversation on a bench nobody thought to write down until decades later. Chapter 7: The Wall Nobody Could Climb. For more than a century, one rule at the Bohemian Grove remained more rigid than any other, more fiercely defended than the club's secrecy about its ceremonies, more carefully guarded than its list of famous members. No women were allowed, not as members, not as guests, not even as employees working the grounds during the encampment. The wives, daughters, and partners of the country's most powerful men could spend their entire lives beside them and still never once be permitted to set foot inside the gates during those 2.5 weeks every summer when their husbands, fathers, and sons vanished into the Redwoods. The club made only the rarest exceptions to this rule, and even those exceptions prove how absolute it otherwise remained. Across its entire history, only 4 women were ever granted honorary membership, each one recognized for extraordinary service to the arts or the club itself, rather than admitted as an equal participant in its social life. The last of these 4 honorary memberships was granted all the way back in 1928. After that, for the better part of a century, the door simply closed and stayed closed. By the late 1970s, that closed door had become a legal target rather than just a source of resentment. California's Fair Employment Practice Agency took direct aim at the club, arguing that its exclusion of women went beyond mere social tradition and crossed into unlawful discrimination, particularly given how many business and professional connections were being made inside those gates. Connections that women in California's workforce were being systematically shut out of, simply because of their gender. If the Grove really was a place where careers were built and reputations cemented, the argument went, then barring an entire gender from that access wasn't just old-fashioned, it was actionable. The fight opened in an administrative hearing room, not a courtroom. In January of 1981, an administrative law judge reviewing the case actually sided with the club, issuing a decision that described how members would openly urinate outdoors among the trees during the encampment, and citing that detail as proof that the retreat's entire culture depended on a level of casual, unguarded masculine informality that simply could not survive if women were present. It was a strange thing to read in an official ruling, a judge essentially agreeing that men's right to relieve themselves against a redwood tree without embarrassment was inseparable from the club's right to exclude an entire gender. Stranger still, the state's own Fair Employment and Housing Commission overturned that decision just months later, ordering the club to begin hiring women. The club appealed, and the legal fight that followed stretched on for years, working its way through the 1980s as the club fought to preserve the very rule that had defined it since its founding. Its lawyers built their defense around what the law calls a bona fide occupational qualification, essentially arguing that the male-only nature of the club was so central to its identity and function that changing it would fundamentally destroy what the Bohemian Grove actually was. It was an unusual argument, asking the courts to accept that exclusion itself was the product being sold, and remarkably, the courts largely agreed. By the conclusion of the case in 1987, when the California Supreme Court declined to review it, the club had successfully defended its right to remain male only, a victory that startled critics and confirmed, in the eyes of many, exactly the kind of untouchable influence the Grove's members were rumored to hold. There was an added layer of discomfort to the proceedings that didn't escape notice at the time. The judge who presided over the Superior Court case had, by some accounts, previously participated in club activities himself, a detail that raised uncomfortable questions about impartiality, even as the ruling moved forward largely in the club's favor, and a request that he step aside was denied. Whether or not it directly influenced the outcome, it added one more thread to the tapestry of insider connections that seemed to follow the Bohemian Grove into every arena it touched: business, politics, and now, apparently, the courtroom itself. The wall held. Decades after the ruling, the Bohemian Grove remains, to this day, a male-only institution, one of the last major private clubs in America to successfully defend that exclusion in court and walk away with its founding rule fully intact. For an organization that spent its first century insisting it was, above all else, a retreat for artists and free thinkers. The fight to keep half the population permanently outside its gates stands as one of the clearest examples of how far the club was willing to go to protect the world it had built for itself among the Redwoods, no matter who was left standing outside, looking in. Chapter 8: Behind the Redwood Curtain. For an organization built on the principle that weaving spiders come not here, the Bohemian Grove has spent the better part of a century fighting an entirely different kind of intrusion. Not businessmen chasing deals, but journalists, activists, and curious outsiders chasing the truth about what actually happens behind its locked gates. Each attempt to get inside added another layer to the mythology, and each new piece of footage or first-hand account seemed to raise more questions than it ever managed to answer. One of the earliest attempts came in 1980, when a man named Rick Kloger managed to slip onto the grounds and observe the encampment from the inside, later sharing what he had witnessed with reporters and researchers eager for any confirmed detail about the club's private world. A year later, in 1981, ABC News sent its own cameras toward the property, attempting to document the retreat for a national television audience, only to run headlong into the same wall of secrecy and security that had kept outsiders at bay for generations. Neither attempt produced anything resembling proof of wrongdoing. What both attempts did produce was confirmation that the club's obsession with privacy was not exaggerated. It was real, and it was enforced. The most detailed and credible account to ever emerge from inside the Grove came in 1989, when journalist Philip Weiss managed to gain access as a guest, and later published a lengthy, closely observed piece for Spy magazine. Weiss's account remains, to this day, one of the most thorough first-hand descriptions of daily life inside the encampment, capturing the drinking, the theater, the lakeside talks, the strange blend of formality and frat house looseness that defined the club's culture. What his reporting notably did not include was any evidence of criminal activity, occult practice, or the kind of sinister conspiracy that outsiders had long suspected. What he found instead was closer to an elaborate, expensive summer camp for the extremely powerful, self-indulgent, insular, and secretive, but grounded in theater and tradition rather than anything resembling the darker rumors already circulating about the place. Those darker rumors reached their loudest, most consequential peak in the year 2000, when broadcaster Alex Jones smuggled a hidden camera onto the property and filmed the cremation of care ceremony from a hidden vantage point in the trees. The footage showed exactly what the ceremony had always involved: robed figures, torchlight, a coffin, the towering owl shrine, flames rising against the night sky. But the way Jones chose to present that footage transformed it into something else entirely. He described what he had filmed as evidence of a ritual sacrifice, framing the ceremony not as elaborate theater, but as proof of something genuinely occult and dangerous happening deep inside the forest. hidden from public view by the club's wealth and influence. No other reporter, researcher, or piece of footage before Jones's recording, or in the decades since, has ever substantiated the idea that an actual sacrifice, ritual or otherwise, has taken place at the Bohemian Grove. No missing persons connected to the club, no documented victims, no corroborating evidence beyond the footage itself, which shows a theatrical ceremony consistent with descriptions the club had never particularly hidden in the first place. Journalist John Ronson, who separately investigated the Grove around the same period, watched much of the same imagery and reached a strikingly different conclusion, describing what he witnessed less as a sinister ritual and more as something closer to an overgrown fraternity party, elaborate, strange, self-important, but ultimately theatrical rather than criminal. That gap between what the footage actually shows and what one broadcaster claimed it proved has never fully closed in the public imagination, and that gap turned out to have consequences far more serious than a media dispute. In 2002, a man named Richard McCaslin entered the Bohemian Grove grounds during the off-season armed with weapons, believing he was on a mission to expose and stop the ritual killings he was convinced were taking place there. He called himself the Phantom Patriot. He found no ceremony, no victims, and no evidence of the crimes he believed he was preventing, only an empty forest and, eventually, law enforcement. McCaslin was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to prison for the armed break-in. And in the years that followed, he spoke publicly about how deeply he had come to regret acting on a claim he had never personally verified. A claim that had convinced him, with total sincerity, that he was walking into a rescue mission rather than an empty patch of trees. McCaslin's story sits at the uncomfortable center of everything this chapter of the Bohemian Grove's history represents. On one side, there is a real, well-documented culture of extreme secrecy, a club that has spent over a century building walls, hiring armed security, and successfully keeping virtually all independent media out of its most private ceremonies. That secrecy is not a rumor. It is a matter of public record, confirmed by every journalist who has ever tried and largely failed to document what happens inside. On the other side, there is a claim of ritual sacrifice that has never been substantiated by anyone beyond the person who first made it. A claim that nonetheless traveled far enough and convinced enough people that it eventually drove an armed man into those woods believing he was saving lives. What actually happened behind the Redwood curtain, based on everything that has been documented across more than 4 decades of attempted infiltration, is neither as innocent as the club's own public relations would suggest, nor as monstrous as its most extreme critics have claimed. It is something harder to sell in a headline, but far closer to the truth. An extraordinarily secretive gathering of powerful men, protected by wealth and privilege from the kind of scrutiny most institutions eventually face, performing theatrical rituals that look considerably more frightening from a hidden camera angle than they apparently are up close. The mystery was never really about what was burning on that altar. It was about how a century of locked gates could make even an ordinary bonfire look, from the outside, like something worth risking prison to stop. Chapter 9. The Fires in the Forest. The Bohemian Grove sold itself and was largely accepted by the outside world as something close to a sanctuary for ancient trees, a private club whose wealth and exclusivity at least came with the benefit of protecting 2,000 acres of old-growth and second-growth redwood forest from the kind of development and logging that had already erased so much of California's original woodland. The club's own mythology leaned heavily on this idea: the owl shrine, the reverence for the towering trees, the sense that this was sacred ground worth guarding at any cost. For decades, that image went largely unchallenged. That image began to crack in 1984, when the club started actively logging portions of its own property, cutting timber from land that members and outsiders alike had long assumed was permanently protected simply by virtue of belonging to an organization that spoke about the forest in almost spiritual terms. The logging wasn't hidden exactly, but it stood in stark, uncomfortable contrast to the reverent language the club had used about its own land for more than a century. The same men who staged an elaborate ceremony honoring the forest's ancient spirit were now signing off on timber sales from the very land. The scrutiny that eventually caught up with that decision didn't come from outside first. It came from inside the club itself. In 2001, a fourth-generation member named John Hooper hiked into a stand of trees he remembered visiting with his grandfather decades earlier and found it tagged for harvest. Almost all the old growth he remembered was already gone. Hooper began organizing opposition from within the club's own ranks, eventually joined by outside environmental groups. Years later, in 2006, the club's own hired forester, the professional responsible for managing the property's timber and advising on sustainable practices, resigned from the position after facing pressure to increase the volume of logging beyond what he considered responsible. It was a striking detail on its own. This wasn't only an outside environmental group making accusations from a distance. This was the club's own member, and eventually its own expert, walking away from a fight over whether the institution was prioritizing profit over the preservation it had spent a century claiming to represent. That internal revolt opened the door for outside legal action that the club had successfully avoided on almost every other front. The Sierra Club, joined by the newly formed Bohemian Redwood Rescue Club, filed suit against the state's approval of the Bohemian Club's logging plan, arguing that the harvesting on the property violated environmental protections and threatened habitat that should have been preserved. The legal battle stretched on for years, working its way through the same California court system that had once sided so firmly with the club during its fight to remain male only decades earlier. This time, the outcome landed differently. On March 10, 2011, Judge Renee Chouteau ruled against the club, revoking the logging permit that had allowed the harvesting to continue and delivering a rare, public defeat to an organization that had spent nearly a century and a half largely getting its way, whether in a court, in politics, or behind its own locked gates. For a club whose entire identity had been built around control, losing control over its own forest carried a particular kind of symbolic weight. It's a smaller story than the ceremonies, the presidents, or the hidden cameras, but in some ways it cuts closer to the heart of what the Bohemian Grove actually was. For a century, the club had asked the public to trust its stewardship of secrets, of tradition, and, not least, of the very trees that gave the retreat its name and its sense of sacred purpose. The logging controversy revealed that even this, perhaps the one claim that should have been the easiest to defend, wasn't entirely true. The redwoods that had stood watching over generations of presidents, industrialists, and secret ceremonies turned out to need protection, not from the outside world, but from the very institution that had built its identity around reverence for them. Chapter 10. Cracks in the Grove. The Bohemian Grove spent most of its history with a kind of immunity from the scrutiny that eventually catches up with almost every powerful institution. Local officials looked the other way. Law enforcement cooperated without asking too many questions. The surrounding community treated the club's annual encampment as simply part of the landscape, an odd but harmless summer tradition that brought wealthy visitors and their money into a rural stretch of Sonoma County for a few weeks each year. In recent years, that immunity has started, slowly and unevenly, to erode. The shift became visible in 2019 when Sonoma County pulled back the level of dedicated law enforcement support it had traditionally provided during the club's encampment, a support arrangement that had long allowed the Grove to maintain its tight security perimeter with the help of local deputies. It was a bureaucratic decision on the surface, framed around budgets and staffing priorities, but it carried an unmistakable message. The automatic, unquestioned cooperation the club had relied on for generations was no longer guaranteed simply because of who its members were. That same year, a Sonoma County supervisor put into public writing what many locals had apparently been saying privately for years, criticizing the club directly for its continued exclusion of women and for what the supervisor characterized as a thin, insufficient level of investment back into the local community, especially considering how much the club had asked of the county in terms of security, road access, and public services during its annual retreat. It was a notable break from the deferential silence that had defined the relationship between the club and local government for most of the 20th century, a sign that even in its own backyard, the the Grove's reputation could no longer count on automatic protection. The scrutiny escalated further in 2023, when reporting revealed that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas had made undisclosed trips to the Bohemian Grove as the guest of a wealthy donor, adding the club to a growing list of destinations connected to broader questions about undisclosed gifts, travel, and relationships between sitting justices and politically connected benefactors. For an institution that had spent decades cultivating an image of harmless, old-fashioned eccentricity, robes and songs and men playing dress-up in the Redwoods, the story landed differently. It reframed the Grove, at least for a news cycle, not as a quaint relic of Gilded Age tradition, but as one more entry in a larger, more serious conversation about accountability, influence, and the ethics of the country's most powerful institutions. Perhaps most tellingly, the cracks appearing in the club's reputation weren't limited to questions of political influence or exclusion. In 2023, and again in 2024, the club faced wage theft lawsuits brought by valets and other workers employed during the encampment, allegations that an organization capable of hosting some of the wealthiest men in America had failed to properly compensate the working-class staff who kept its elaborate retreat running behind the scenes. It was an unglamorous, almost mundane kind of scandal compared to the club's mythology of hidden rituals and presidential secrets, but in its own way, it cut just as deep. The same institution that had built an entire ceremony around symbolically burning away care and worry was now being accused, in a courtroom rather than a forest clearing, of shortchanging the very people hired to serve it. None of these individual controversies threatened to bring the Bohemian Grove down entirely. The club continues to operate, continues to gather every summer beneath the same redwoods, continues to guard its gates with the same determination it always has. But, taken together, they represent something the club had successfully avoided for the better part of a century and a half: the slow, uneven, but unmistakable arrival of consequences. The forest was no longer entirely private. The world outside the gates had finally started asking questions the club couldn't simply wait out. Chapter 11. After the fire burns out. So, what is actually true about the Bohemian Grove, once you strip away both the reverent mythology the club has built around itself and the darker rumors that have followed it for more than a century? The honest answer sits somewhere far less dramatic than either version, and somehow that makes it more unsettling rather than less. There is no evidence of ritual sacrifice, of occult harm, of the kind of literal darkness that sent an armed man into those woods believing he was saving lives. What actually happened in that clearing was theater, torchlight, and a coffin full of symbolism rather than anything real. But strip away that rumor, and what remains is still worth sitting with. A private club, founded by artists and overtaken by money within a single generation. A retreat where sitting presidents, Supreme Court justices, industrialists, and the architects of the atomic bomb have all, at different points, found their way to the same stretch of private forest, technically forbidden from discussing business, and somehow shaping the country's direction anyway. A wall that kept out an entire gender for over a century and survived a direct legal challenge. A club that spoke about ancient trees in reverent, almost sacred language while quietly logging them. And a wage dispute with its own valets that reads less like a conspiracy and more like an ordinary story about power forgetting to look downward. That, in the end, is the real dark story hiding inside the Redwoods. Not a monster wearing a robe, but the far more familiar, far more American story of unaccountable power, protected for generations by wealth, tradition, and locked gates, allowed to operate for a century and a half with almost no outside oversight simply because nobody with enough authority ever forced the question. The owl was never the thing worth fearing. What should unsettle you is everything the owl was allowed to watch over, unwitnessed for so long. The gates are still there. The armed guards still walk the perimeter every summer. The cremation of care still burns each July. The same invocations, the same booming voice from the hillside, the same coffin set alight beside the lake. Somewhere among those redwoods, men who help run this country are still gathering the way they have for more than a century, still insisting that nothing important happens there, even as history quietly suggests otherwise. whatever is actually true about the Bohemian Grove, and this documentary has tried to separate the documented from the merely whispered, one thing remains certain. As long as those gates stay locked, and as long as the world outside is kept guessing, the questions will keep growing louder than anything the club could ever hope to answer.